differences, but that, I think will probably speak to some people more than others. And so just make sure you let me know if you have any questions. And I think Jim, I think you and I are in the same class, right? So we're both about 2 years out, a little bit over 2 years out. So
yeah. And so there's a diversity within the panel that I wanted to kind of highlight with the introduction slide here. Also, I noticed that a number of the audience is still applying to fellowship too. So certainly a lot of the questions will apply to both things. So don't be bashful about asking, fellowship or job related questions. So we're here to offer advice. I'm looking for a job after fellowship, but obviously we can offer fellowship advice as well, since we've done that. And Mallory, you can certainly feel free to weigh in there too, and any other fellows on the call. And then hopefully we'll answer some of the questions. Now, Mallory gave us a number of different questions that we'll go through. But to start, what I wanted to do is just kind of throw out some general questions to the panelists, and we'll kind of go around the horn here and discuss a little bit more than what we just did. So, and with that, I will ask Candace, then what were your motivations for choosing your initial job? And then kind of dive right into kind of the second part there is how did what were your expectations? And how did it meet or not meet your expectations?
Okay. All right. And so motivations for choosing my initial job. I wanted to stay in academic medicine coming out of fellowship. I enjoy teaching and working with residents and medical students. Same reasons, I guess, anybody goes into academics, clinical research, staying up to date, being surrounded by people who are experts in their field. I chose to go back to Pittsburgh. I had a few job options, but what I liked about the Pittsburgh job were the opportunities for research and the opportunities for collaboration. It was the place where I did my residency training, so it was familiar. I feel like I'm leaving something out. The job itself, so the work itself. And so I was going to be 100% neurotology. It can be sometimes hard when you're comparing jobs or shopping jobs to find the job that you get to do everything you want to do. And some of even the other academic jobs, I was going to have a fair share of my practice being general ENT, and that was not something I wanted to do. And so that was also one of the main motivations. If somebody on the phone could mute, please. Or Mallory, do you have muting powers? Actually, I just did it. And so, yeah, so I stayed in that job for 2 years. I left because of some issues with the contract not living up to what it was supposed to be, not meeting the initial job offer that I received in writing. And so I started looking for a new job. I looked at both private practice jobs as well as academic jobs. And I think the same motivations that landed me at Pittsburgh got me to Emory with a little bit different perspective, however. And I'll just kind of stop there.
Jameson, what about you?
Yeah, so I stayed on at Ohio State where I did my fellowship, and I think a lot of the reasons that I stayed there was a couple of reasons, because I was, as a fellow, and at the beginning of that I was, I had a very significant dedication to research that I kind of continued on, and I had some projects that I was involved in that were easy, and they were they were just. It was a nice flow to transition from basically doing the same thing. And it was a really awesome place for me to kind of get my feet wet as far as, doing really advanced neurotology and doing, as others have said, is that, I'm doing 100% neurotology, and it was really nice. I think that I had no specific necessary complaints about my day-to-day job. My biggest issue, truthfully, at the end of the day was I just kind of lost a lot of passion for doing the research. And it had a lot to do with grant writing and kind of what my expectations were from that standpoint. I didn't mind doing different projects, especially smaller ones, but some of the larger projects, I just found that I really did not have the passion for it. And I really kind of opened up to a lot of different areas I looked at other academic jobs. I looked at private practice jobs. I looked at, basically places on the east side of the United States, Midwest and Southeast mainly. And, a friend of mine who was in practice here had called me and asked me, and they kind of went over the details of the job. And it was a place where I could do, I had very little competition, and there was a lot of room to grow. And that's probably what was most interesting to me, was like, I wanted to build a practice. I was much more interested in that than building a research thing. And, that was kind of the, at the end of the day, it was kind of a leap of faith that I would enjoy this, considering my previous experiences. But, it's been exactly what I wanted as far as that's concerned. I can kind of build my practice the way I wanted to. I've got a lot more leeway day to day on what I can do with my schedule and my clinics and my ORs. So I just have a lot more control over just my day to day, job, without having to worry about really digging into writing big grants, and things like that. And so it was kind of that kind of balance between those two is kind of how I ended up where I was. I think that probably at the end of the day, the one thing I'll tell you is that when you're looking for a job, just be very honest with yourself about what it is that you want. Because I didn't necessarily have a bad experience. I just don't think I was really that honest with myself about what I exactly wanted. So.
Yeah, and that's good advice. And certainly my motivations, aside from all the academic stuff that was already talked about, that's clearly there for me, and that's what I was interested in. But location was another one. I grew up on the East Coast. My wife and I are from the East Coast, and she wanted to move back there. So those are all kind of legitimate reasons for and motivations for choosing an initial job. And certainly those things need to be considered, because at least in my experience, I love my job, but I also it's really nice to come home and be personally happy as well as professionally happy. And so those were some of my motivations as well, in addition to the other things mentioned, to make sure that my personal life met certain expectations as well. And so let's move on. I want to bring up kind of the next batch of questions. So there were really a couple of different questions, categories, and so I'm going to go through them here. One is questions regarding the application and the interviewing process. Two, the big question, private practice versus academics, and I think there's a third, contracts and negotiation. And so those are the big topics we'll get into, and then there's this other section as well. All right, and so we'll go back to part one and kind of answer these questions. And here's, I guess, let me just ask this to the audience before I dive into the questions. Do you guys prefer to see everyone's face? I don't need the PowerPoint up. I just figured I would do it this way. But if you want to see everyone as a bigger thing on the screen, we can do that too. I'm struggling to see what everyone's reaction is, so that would be my preference. If everyone's all right with that, I can scrap the PowerPoint, but I'll let somebody else.
I think that's a good idea.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Then we'll do it that way. And so then we'll just go around with the question. These are questions from the audience, okay, that were given to us earlier. And so I'll start this time with Jameson. So what did you find was a good source for finding where and when jobs are posted? Did you use any other resources like Practice Link, New England Journal, ANS, Health Careers, all those things? What resource did you use to find your job?
Honestly, I looked at some of those over, especially beginning of my fellowship, but honestly, it was word of mouth from my mentors and fellowship, and actually some of those in residencies as well. I would get an occasional text message or during a case, they would say, hey, such and such place has a job opening. Do you have any interest in this? And, I would either say yes or no, depending upon, a couple of things. If they said it was somewhere in the country that I didn't have any interest, the conversation would kind of stop there. But I would say 95% of who I ended up talking to was based upon word of mouth. And then maybe one where I was at a conference where I went up to a person saying, hey, that's a place I could potentially be, and just introduce myself and say, hey, I'm a neurotologist or a neurotology fellow. And I am interested in, talking more about, your institution if you have a spot. And then, So, you know, that was 95% of my initial job. The second job was a little bit different. That was really me actively looking around kind of behind the scenes. I really wasn't advertising that I was leaving, and it was more or less just kind of getting my feelers out there about like who has a job at different academic institutions and a place where I wanted to be. And it was the second time around, it's a lot easier because I didn't have to worry about finding a job. I had a job that was perfectly fine, or more, very fine for most people, and I could take my time and talk to different people, and that was more or less, I was being very, very selective about what I want to do. But back to your original question, 95% of it was just word of mouth. So,
Candace, do you have any resource that you liked?
No, I think I'd agree with Jameson. Word of mouth is, I think, the most, the two jobs that I've had both came word of mouth, directly from those institutions telling me they were looking for a person. Even interviewing at other institutions, I did do some cold calls, cold emails, and had some interviews, but I'd say for the most part, especially the ones where I, made it the furthest along or had offers, were ones where I heard from that institution directly that they were looking for somebody. But there are, jobs are advertised, and you should certainly look into those, because it may be, a situation where you don't know somebody at that institution, so they don't know to reach out to you. And so the Academy has its bulletin publication. I don't remember how frequently it comes out, but jobs are posted there. There's certainly practice link. I don't know about the whole recruiter thing. I feel uneasy. They strike me as salesmen, but I'm sure there's people who have success with recruiters. But I'd say word of mouth, number one. Number two, cold call, cold email. And then number three, gosh, I don't know. Maybe I'll just do those two.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I cold call basically everyone that I spoke with. And it takes a little bit of kind of, breaking your comfort zone at times, but it often, you'd be surprised at how many times you get a response too, because it's a well-connected world in such a small world. So a cold email with mention of somebody else that through the grapevine, who trained with them or has met them will often kind of elicit some sort of response. And so that's the way I went about that. It was a cold email from me usually, but it was, hey, I know this guy, he mentioned to reach out to you, do you have anything, or could we talk more? And so I think that was kind of how I went about it. But then do keep your ear to the ground from particular advertisements, particularly in the ENT journals. Someone had mentioned New England Journal, but I think that's a little bit, neurotology is a little bit small for places like that, in my opinion. But so the next question then, all right, and this is a good one because I think we'll get diversity of answers here. How early is too early to contact a job prospect? First year, second year, potentially even before fellowship. And so I'll just start because my answer is easy. It's never too early. I submitted my application like a couple of months into my fellowship for the current job that I have. The recruiting process often takes a long time. There's all these things they have to do. People get busy, and so there's no timeline that's too early, in my opinion. But what do you guys think? Candace, go. I'll have you go first.
Absolutely agree. Never too early, for a number of reasons. I think the biggest that it's never too early is, one, people can get to know you and know that you're looking and not feel rushed to get to know somebody to match into a position. Oops, second. And then another is that an institution may not need somebody right now. They might not need somebody next summer. They might not need somebody for 2 years. And so that's perfect because you're on their radar and you're kind of at the top of their list. And so especially if there's somewhere you really want to be, I'd say reach out right away and then follow up. I mean, don't harass them. But if you haven't heard back, or if they say they're going to check back in with you and they haven't, reach back out. I think I think the goal for most fellows is to try to have a job offer December to probably March, February of their second year of fellowship. And so you'll be interviewing, doing a lot of interviews early in your second year, and right now around academy, which is different because it won't be in person. But I'd say the earlier, the better. And then there's some people, you know, who going into fellowship already have a job lined up. And so, and that could be you. So certainly start early if you can.
I agree with everything. I think that it's going to heat up for most people around a year to academy time, so 9 months or so. I think that the people who I talked to that didn't have a job, they were really starting to pick up on the amount of people they were talking to and the amount of interviews they had. You know, like Candace was saying, if you know, going back to your home institution, for instance, you may already have a job by the time you leave your residency or something like that. But yeah, I don't think I think one of the points that they made is that, you know, if you contact them 2 years in advance, they may have been planning to, advertise a job a year from then. And if you're already in there, you know, talking to them and getting to know them, you may have a huge step. It may never be an issue that you're competing for a job, which I don't think that's necessarily a huge problem that most people have is competition for a job. But, you know, you may be able to just do that off the radar, and it's probably much easier for you, I think, if you can do it earlier like that. But at the same time, I think if you're not having a job, you know, a year out, I don't think that's anything abnormal either. I think it really heats up around the academy time, like they were talking about.
Yeah, I feel like I've mastered the art of being tactfully annoying. That's how I phrase it. You know, like by all objective measures, I'm annoying, but you know, when you're talking to these people, you have to do it tactfully. So don't do it too much, but you never too early to reach out. So. And then on the topic of cold calls or cold emails, who do you guys email? Candace, when you made cold calls, who did you reach out to?
The head neurotologist, whoever that is. That's who I talk to. You know, if it's a chairman, it happens to be the same person, then great. But I would always talk to whoever the division head of the neurotology department or division is.
I think I did the same.
I don't think it's wrong to do the chairman. I just think that, you know, you're going to get more, you know, head and neck surgeons don't always know who neurotologists are and vice versa and stuff like that. I mean, they may have a sense if they're very well connected and more famous in the field, but generally speaking, if you call some other neurotologist or email them, they're going to know who your people that are going to, you know, vouch for you are. And I think it just makes it easier.
So my caveat to that is I agree that a neurotologist would be best, but I always went for the administrator to the neurotologist, because if you get the administrator's ear, the neurotologist, who may or may not know you, is more likely to respond to their email than your email. And so I'm a big believer in going to the number 2 to get to the number 1, because you're more likely to get a response. So just my caveat there. So that's what I did. And then, then the question becomes, who do you have reach out? Do you do it, or do you have someone introduce you to do it? Do you have your fellowship director or a colleague that you know introduce you to someone else, or do you do it yourself? I can tell you, I personally reached out, but go ahead, Candace.
Yeah, same. I did it myself.
I think, yeah, I agree. I don't think there's a scenario where I wouldn't, you know, reach out, but I think that if you have, in addition, another email or a call from somebody is also helpful. You know, I think that, but I think certainly you need to be personally the one who says something like, hey, I have interest, you know, here's my CV, etc.
And that's another good tip too, I think, that Jameson brought up is a cold email doesn't offer a lot without some background, and so always attach something, a CV, you know, a cover letter, just something else for them to kind of, you know, throw away, but at least if they want to go recover it, they know where it is.
Yeah, I agree. I included both my CV and a cover letter, and the cover letter was specific to that job.
Yeah. That would be not a great mistake to make. Make sure if you're going to make it specific, it's got to be the right institution. So, all right. So now there's a couple questions that delve into kind of some other topics, private practice versus academics. But before I do, I want to give the anyone in the audience a chance to follow up on any of the advice that we gave or our experiences. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions in the audience about that?
I have a question about your experience, both for Dr. Hobson and Mattingly. What was it like becoming faculty at a place where you trained? You hear things like you will always be known as the resident or you will always be known as the fellow from your peers, faculty, and other residents. So just curious if you ran into any problems or not.
I didn't run into any big problems. It certainly does exist. There's this, I think it's more with your mentors than anything. I think that I was treated very well, but with the residents, for instance, they cycle through pretty quickly. I mean, you get to a crop that doesn't know you very well pretty quickly, and they start calling you Dr. Mattingly instead of whatever you go by. And you're like, wait a minute, like when did this transition happen? So that's not really an issue. The staff treated me very well, but I will tell you that there was some like, oh yeah, you're the fellow, we'll we can push some things off on you if needed, but it wasn't really that bad. I mean, I guess you occasionally hear horror stories, but overall it was, these people are people I spent almost every day with for 2 years. So they knew me well. I knew them well. Usually if they hire you, it's going to be a pretty easy transition, I would think. So.
I agree. I don't think that was a major problem, and certainly didn't factor into my choosing to leave. Being gone for 2 years, it's not a long time, but being gone for 2 years means that the people who were chiefs when I came back were only PGY2s, when I was last there. And so there's already that kind of separation between a fifth year resident and a second year resident. And then from a faculty perspective, I think one of the advantages is that people who were your mentors can continue to be your mentor, and people there and aren't afraid to go to with questions or concerns. So I wouldn't say it's a largely negative thing.
Anybody else? I think by and large, a lot of the things we're referring to or commenting on in relationship to jobs largely apply to fellowships too. And so, if a cold email, notifying someone of your application or your interest in a program doesn't hurt, my suggestion would be to go to the program coordinator and CC the fellowship director or something. Just again, so because the program coordinator is the one who usually keep all that information, for the most part. And so then looking into the next category of questions, private practice versus academics. And so, Jameson, I'm going to rely a lot on you to answer some of the private practice questions. And so somebody asked about what they refer to as Privademics. Does it really exist? And I can well, I don't know that I have direct insight into this, but it does. That's a lot how I trained in my residency. We had a senior neurotologist who was retiring during my residency at the academic place, but there was a private practice guy who was Hopkins trained, and most of my training was with him as a private practitioner who was adjunct at the health center. And so, yes, it does exist. It's pretty unusual, at least in my survey, but does anyone else have experience with that on the panel? Jameson, do you work with residents?
I work with medical students, but no residents. So it's not really, it's quite a bit different than my academic job. I mean, an academic job, I had fellow and several residents, we had 5 residents a year. I mean, it was quite the opposite. So I do some teaching now at the audiology school in the town where I'm at. And I have some medical students that will rotate in and out with me, but it's a lot different than having a resident or a fellow around. I mean, the expertise is just, way different. And like, it's basically everything I do myself. So,
I'd say Privademics is a real thing, but it's very rare. But the model that I was a part of was in my fellowship at UC San Diego. And so, as some of you may know, at UC San Diego, the fellows split their time between Kaiser, Southern California, and there in San Diego, and UCSD. And so half of the time is at UCSD. And in the pre-Friedman days, most of the skull base came from Kaiser. And so the main neurotologist there, Bob Cueva, is very much an academic. He's the former president of AOS, publishes a lot, teaches residents, teaches fellows. And so that's, I think, a great model of Privademics, but really very unusual, rare.
I think depending upon the fellowship you go to, you're going to see some of that. There are a couple fellowships out there that are very, I think, there's not going to be a lot of residents around. It's going to be the fellows and the attendings, and that'll give you, I think, at least some sense of it. But I agree. I think it's more the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah. And the other interesting question that we haven't really touched upon here is, and maybe this is tough for the people on the panel specifically to answer, but how difficult would it can be considered to go from private practice back to academia? That's kind of a loaded question, I think, for a number of reasons. One, nobody's really done it. Two, and I think it's a little bit, I don't know, kind of, one, doesn't happen very often. I don't know if it's taboo or not, but does anyone have any thoughts or experience with that? I don't know if you guys know on the panel, and the last president of the ANS, Brad Kessler, was actually in private practice. So he talks a lot about that. And so, I mean, it's definitely possible. And just for the record, a number of the presidents of the ANS have been in private practice too. John McElveen in private practice, he was president a number of years ago. And so neurotology, among many of the specialties, I think, doesn't seem to be as discriminatory as people perceive it. At least that's my experience.
Based upon my conversations I had with some different people when I was switching jobs, I think that it would be totally possible. I think that you'd probably end up having to go to a place that just really needed a neurotologist. I think if you wanted to go to a big academic place, you may struggle with that. But I think that, thankfully, neurotologists aren't growing on trees, and so that's nice in that, there's going to be places that are smaller to medium sized that just need somebody who can do complicated ear surgery and skull-based surgery and teach their residents. And that's probably, so I think there's always, from my standpoint, I think I could, but my choices would be very limited. So.
All right. So then another question which I thought was worth talking about on this panel, somebody had asked, is there a way to find out where recent neurotology fellows end up? And Mallory, maybe you have some insight into this as well. But I know the ANS does collect information about all their fellows. And so I know you can, I think you have to be a member to get that information. I don't think they just hand it out, but you can certainly reach out to the ANS and find a lot of that information. Do you know anything, any other resources?
No, unfortunately I don't, but that would be my best guess, is reaching out to the administrators of the ANS.
It might also be worthwhile for people, when you look at a program, to kind of see the track record and history of where their fellows end up, because again, that becomes important for job connections and things too. I don't know, Candace, do you have any other thing to weigh in on there?
No, but I think it's a great idea. I think it'd be nice if there were, if that information were kept somewhere that's accessible, even if it's not published. I know Kristen and Ashley are very busy, but you could perhaps work with them to start collecting that data and just have it available.
He would be great, because we talked about this recently, because I got asked on a podcast, what percentage of neurotologists are in academics or private practice. And I was like, well, I actually don't know the answer to that. I think more are in academics than private practice. But, I think one of the advantages is that I think if you were to ask all three of us over the last 5 years where most people are, we probably know, because it's such a small field. But so just kind of being around it, you kind of get a sense of where people are. But yeah, I don't know of any perfect, resource that has it where you can have that breakdown.
Valerie, it is a good incentive, and I know the ANS has the Young ANS, Society. There is the Education Committee. So all of these things kind of fall under various purviews that I think the ANS would be open to kind of keeping or making available to members. So.
Yeah, but Ashley, just adding on, Ashley and Kristen do keep a list of all of the fellows, so they know who all of the fellows are, and so they know who all the fellows are going back. And so perhaps you could ask for that list, and some of us could help you to fill in the blanks, or Google can probably fill in the blanks. You just need the names.
It's probably a publication in there too, is my guess. So.
All right, and so now let's move on to contracts and negotiations, because I think this is going to be part of what the panel wants to hear as we fall into the last part of the hour here. So Candace, I'll ask you first. What was your approach to contract negotiation? And this is, a big question, but see what you can do.
Oh yeah, that's a hard one. Well, so I negotiated
intimidation. That's what fear and just overpower the person.
Yeah, I thought I negotiated a pretty decent contract for myself in my first job, and then unfortunately had an offer letter of intent in December, and then tried to get the contract for 6-7 months and didn't get it till the middle of July. It was different. So first get a final contract in writing as soon as possible and be pushy about it. Second, there's lots of things to negotiate in a contract. So there's, and what's negotiable depends on where you're going. Some institutions have set salary based on years in rank and what your rank is. Some don't. Other things to negotiate are OR block time, office space, other resources, research stuff, which Jim can probably speak more to. I'm trying to think of what else. Those are the big things off the top of my head. It helps if you have more than one offer, and so that helped me in negotiating my first contract, is that I had 2 other offers, and so I was able to use that as leverage to get the salary that I wanted. And so even if you have your heart set on one place, I'd say I'd encourage you to interview as many places as you're potentially interested to land. And then have a second set of eyes. And so, we're all new to this and trying to figure out what's reasonable and what's fair. And so I shared my contract with my fellowship director and also with Bob Cueva, or the offer, salary, whatever, and said, is this fair? And they gave honest answers, and that was useful.
Jameson, what about you? You've gone through now 2 different types of negotiation.
Yeah. It's the first one was really, after going through the second one, I realized how stupid I was on the first one. I will tell you, there wasn't a lot, like, our salary was set at Ohio State. I mean, when you came in, it basically was set. There was a couple of things that I probably was naive. Well, there certainly was a couple of things I was naive about, but at Ohio State, it certainly was. Research was the main thing. It was how much kind of a startup package could you get, and then kind of what your breakdown was of your total FTE. So what percentage are you clinical and what percentage are you research? And I think probably going into it, that's a hard question, I think, to answer, because, you're in fellowship, typically you're 4 to 5 days a week of doing clinical stuff, and then you go to a different, breakdown of your job. It is quite a challenging thing to understand about yourself. And I think that's probably where I wasn't particularly honest with myself about what I wanted. But that there was a lot of stuff that was already set into place with the actual academic job. With the private practice job, it was totally different because it was the salary range is a lot different, and it had a lot to do with the main really negotiable points were during my salary time, did I have the opportunity to bonus depending upon how productive I was. So if I met my, my overhead, my collections minus my overhead, did I get a percentage of that, or do you just cut it off at your salary for however long that is? Usually it's 1 to 2 or 3 years in most private practice jobs that at least that I talk to. And then the other thing is with a private practice, most places you're talking about a buy-in of some sort. So what does that mean, and how much does that cost, and is that reasonable? Because those prices vary wildly across the country, and those are significant financial decisions that really come into play, and those can really bite you in the butt if you're not careful, because you may find yourself, in a scenario in a scenario where you didn't quite understand what certain things meant if you left, if the practice changed, for instance. And I think there's less fluidity in academics. So that was one of the things that I really had to spend a lot of time, was understanding the finer nuances of that when I was negotiating a private practice job. And as Candace said, I didn't do this the first time around. I actually just had some people that I trusted review my contract, but I actually had an attorney review my contract this time. And I'm not sure exactly how helpful they were, but it was more of an educational thing. They taught me a few things about some, jargon that maybe I didn't quite understand super well, or and they were able to actually pull the statistics across the country of what you should be getting paid in your geographical area. And I think I could have done that with an academics as well, but I think they probably would have been like, no, this is your set salary. It's, that's really not a negotiable part of what we're talking about here. So in private practice, I think there's definitely more nuance, and there's actually, from a personal standpoint, there's more financial stake, of what's going on, because you have much more invested in the actual business that you're in. So.
Yeah.
I got a couple questions for you guys. So how about an academic job question? Was your understanding of your workload reasonable? Did the powers that be convey that information reasonably well or reasonably fairly?
Yes.
So for
Yes.
example, we do 100 acoustics. No, you don't. You do 20. And how are we dividing up those 20, for example? Or sinus surgeries or whatever. It doesn't make a difference. So you guys felt that you got good info from the powers that be?
I was a fellow at the place I started my academic practice, so it was easy. I knew who was doing what. That really made it a lot easier. And I knew exactly what you were saying. If you did 80, 100 acoustics or whatever, you're like, I'm going to get 10 of those probably as a new guy, and so that was very helpful. But from my standpoint, yes, but I think I cheated because I was at the same place. So.
Yeah, I entered an entirely new system and was entering a big city like Boston, where there were already, probably 20 people that did what I did. And certainly it probably exceeded my expectations. I thought I'd be seeing dizziness and tinnitus, for the first 10 years of my life. And, every once in a while something cool comes in. And so that was promised and certainly held true. So yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. And I think just kind of the balance of interesting things that I have in my practice is certainly better here than it was at my first job. And so I think one thing to ask about, whether you're going into private practice or academics, but especially if you're in a practice where there's more than one neurotologist or whatever your subspecialty is asking how referrals are handled. And so how will you build your practice, or how do they decide what's coming to you versus not?
And then how about really the same question from a private practice standpoint? It may depend who's in the group and who you're joining and how much specialization there is too, but reasonable information given to you about expectations and workload. Obviously in academics, unless you're taking over somebody's job, or if you're coming into a group that has a long wait list, you are costing that practice money for the first couple of years. And that can certainly be the case in private practice as well too. So you think it was clear to you guys starting out how all of that was really working? Not necessarily if you can beat targets and get bonus, but how much are you expected to be in the red?
That was probably the most important question that I had going into my private practice job, because it was so different. The financial structure of it was a lot different than the academic one, and understanding it was actually easier, but there's a lot more at stake for me personally, I think. And I had a general sense of, just from in my academic practice, how many referring sources I had, true referring sources, other ENT referring sources. And so I knew that I was joining a practice of 7 other guys who could refer to me. That brings up another point. What are they referring to you? And basically I had a conversation with them beforehand about like, hey, I need to know, I knew cochlear implants, probably stapes and acoustics for sure, but tympanoplasties, tymp mastoids, like cholesteatomas. And those are really the key questions, because there's usually somebody in the practice who does a lot of ear surgery. Almost every practice has one of those. And so I think having a really, upfront conversation with your future partners about like, hey, what are you thinking? What is your experience? Do you guys want to give it up? Et cetera. And then really the next question I had after that is like, how is your relationship with the other ear, nose, and throat practices in your community? Because I, as a neurotologist, I knew I was going to rely on at least a handful more to have a busy practice. And there are practices around that they may not get along with very well. And that's something you don't really know until you really get into it. And I've gotten lucky from that standpoint, but that I think was a scenario just in the not so distant past with my practice where they didn't get along very well. And thankfully things had changed a little bit before I got here, but that could have made my life a lot more complicated if I came in and only had five referring sources, because that would not have made me nearly busy enough. And I'd had to pick up more general practice, which I do about 5%, 10% maybe general right now. And I don't mind it. But I didn't want to do 20 or 30 or 40. And that makes things, I think to answer your question, I had to do a lot more investigating about what it is I was getting myself into.
I would kind of echo what Jameson said, but also recognize that applies for academics too. I'm, like I said, I'm in Boston, and there's 20 other people that do what I do. What do I bring to the table? And so it started out by kind of, my chief kind of giving me some names of referral sources, but I then cold called all the other practices and introduced myself. And, told them what I do. We set up meetings about my background, where I'm from. And so just because you're in academics doesn't mean you're protected from all that legwork, because, well, don't expect people to just show up wherever you go, even if you're at the academic place. A cold phone call goes a long way, I'll tell you. I now, every time someone comes directly from an ENT, I still call or email that ENT directly, because it's very impersonal. The sending them a letter and all that, it's nice, but like, it doesn't really do much. And so even in academics, I still do that. And so I built kind of my referral source that way. But Candace, do you have anything different to add?
No, I mean, I think that's great, and something that I wish I'd done or probably could start doing now. I think that's great advice to call your referral sources and introduce yourself, and also say thank you. And then I think it's really helpful to know the local ENTs. I have there's an otologist, a Silverstein trained otologist here in town, who I met at a course about a year ago, and since then she's been sending me kind of interesting ear cases that for whatever reason she doesn't want to do. So it's certainly very useful to know, who's in town and to get to know them and to show them your work.
Yeah, the one thing that I do want to add too, I want to touch upon, because I know a lot of you have asked this private versus academic thing, and Candace, you could probably weigh in on this too. I think it's worth noting that in the contract negotiation, when you sit down to have these meetings with people, particularly in academics, make sure you recognize and understand what the promotion process is like, because that is really, really important in terms of academics, right? You know, there's some, I mean, various institutions have various ways to go about that. And you want to make sure that the effort you put into non-clinical things also get recognized, because I don't get paid for a single paper I write. I don't get paid for a single student that I mentor, but I keep track of all of this because every year I meet, I make sure to say, hey, listen, I'm bringing all this clinically, but here's what I've done academically, and this is all how you get promoted within the academic system. So every student you mentor as a fellow, write their name down, keep them on your CV. Every paper you publish, make sure you keep that, you know, record of all the things that research you've been involved in, whether published or not, you know, that kind of stuff, because that all contributes to your academic time and promotion time. And so, Candace, I don't know what your promotion process is like, but I don't micromanage a lot in my life, but that is the one thing that I do myself. So I want you to tell your experience with that too, Candace, because everybody's different.
Yeah, sure. I haven't been promoted yet, but I am similar to Jim, keeping my CV up to date with kind of everything I do. So every committee I'm on, every student, you know, I mentor through a project or just mentor period, keep track of all of those things. And the promotion process works differently at each institution. One thing that I really like about Emory, and it varies from place to place, I wouldn't say that it's quite black and white, but there's kind of a set list of criteria for promotion, and you can be promoted based on service, based on education, based on scholarship, and you choose a track and you kind of focus on that, and kind of knowing what targets you need to meet in order to be promoted is important, because it can kind of help to guide you as to what to be involved in and where to focus your attention and your time. And then it's not all about the money, but when you think about promotion or you think about raises, and so depending also on where you go, you may get a raise every year that you're in that position, but certainly with a promotion comes a raise. And those aren't things that many people ask about. I didn't ask about in interviewing for this position, but just things that you should be aware of may or may not be out there.
A couple other things that came up that I want to touch upon as we kind of get to the last few minutes here from the group is Jameson, what were some must-ask questions? Was there anything that you asked everywhere you interviewed, like kind of a must-ask? And then the kind of corollary and follow-up to that is, were there any red flags that you looked out for during your interview process?
The red flags for me was a much easier question, because it had a lot to do with the history of people there in the past. You know, had they had a lot of turnover? You know, had they had people that I've actually known that had been there and left, or you know, what was the actual kind of temperature as far as the actual neurotology division was concerned? The private practice is kind of a different thing, because there's not really divisions. You know, it's just one private practice group, and honestly, I had to rely a lot on the people that I knew. The reason I was actually talking to those people in the past were they people that I trusted, and you know, they people like when we talked about each of the partners of the group, what did they say about that? Were they easy to get along with? But so from a private practice standpoint, it's much harder because I didn't know any of these people. Whereas when I talked to other academic institutions, I at least had some familiarity with them, or at least I could talk to people who did have familiarity with them. So, you know, from a red flag standpoint, it was really more of the history of the actual division or the department that I was actually joining or would be joining. Must ask questions. You know, for me, it was, you know, it was, you know, really the salary itself didn't necessarily mean a lot to me, but, you know, how does that change over time and what is that based upon? You know, like having some cursory sense of how these numbers come to be, you know, as far as, are you someone who, you know, just having a basic understanding of the financial structure? Is it an RVU model? Is it a collection model? Is there something else that's going on in there? And when I was a fellow, I don't think I really understood all that at all. I mean, I kind of understood just kind of in principle what they were, but I didn't really understand what that meant how do I rise to a different level throughout my career, whether that's financially. While I was in academics, the promotion process was probably one of the more, I would say, aggravating parts of the whole thing, because there was just a certain time period you just couldn't do anything, right? You were just kind of, just increasing your CV and doing all these things that you guys were talking about. And I actually found that to be quite annoying, for a couple of different reasons I can touch on later if you'd like me to. But it was more about, how do I get from point A to point B to point C over the duration of my career. And that changes a lot, I think, depending upon the institution you are at. And I think that it'd be surprising that, if you can go to one institution and another, and their insurers are way better or way worse, or, there's all kinds of different nuance into that you don't understand. How, at the end of the day, do you make a salary, or what is your potential? And then how do you, what is it that's going on within that department that you could rise to a different level. One of the reasons I like my current job is it's very simple. I don't have a position to rise to. It's more about building a program, and it's more about, if I do this much work, I get this in reward, I guess. So I don't think I necessarily had a set question, other than, how do I get to different points along the process.
Candace, what about you? What were some red flags for you?
I think similar to what Jameson said, turnover within the department. Are you, the third neurotologist in 6 years? That's a red flag. Sometimes it's not even like a red flag. You have to, have your eyes peeled for. Sometimes people will just say stuff that makes it obvious that they're not happy there, or they're not happy with the leadership. Like, if somebody's giving you a warning, just listen to it.
I'll always say, I'll echo that. If anybody says anything negative, you should pay very much attention to it, because typically they don't say much negative unless there's, I think, something substantial.
Yeah. And people will say it. And so listen, that's it.
Yeah, I think, I can say, we obviously all took the job that we did because we didn't see, many red flags, or enough red flags to kind of turn away from things. But, for me, it was things that lack of clarity in some of the things. For example, I talked about the promotion process, and I think I emphasized that because the current job I'm at made it very clear that this is how you get promoted and this is the process. And the other place I went to, said, didn't give me a lot of detail. They said, oh, well, we'll just kind of, we'll decide, down the road. And I'm like, well, this is part of why you go into academics, is to get promoted. And so, lack of clarity or detail on certain things, I think, was important. And so, for the last couple of minutes, Mallory, I want to kind of open it up to the floor to see, if there's anybody wants to add anything, raise their hand, ask any specific questions. We covered a lot. I don't know, if we covered specific questions for everyone, but hopefully you guys feel comfortable speaking up.
Yeah, I think it was a great general discussion. Thanks, everybody. Feel free to just chime in, speak up if you have something. Wow, maybe people are working up the courage. I'll ask a question. There's like some statistic out there that represents the the departure from an initial job being super high, something like 80% in the first couple of years. What do you make of that, and how do you avoid that?
Jim, are you still at your first job?
I am. I want to be here forever. So as long as they don't let me go, I'm going to stay. Geographically, I love it. My vision aligns with the people at the top. And so I kind of had that sense coming in. So I'm not the person to ask, but I'll let you guys weigh in.
Candace, how long were you into yours before you switched?
So I was in my first job for 2 years, but that means I started looking for a new job after 1 year.
Yeah.
And as I said, it was contract, and then with that comes feeling, Jim talked about the promotion process and things being clear, transparent. And so seeking transparency, getting straight answers.
I think your question is I think that people don't know what they want. And I think that it's very easily blinded to the first job. It's a much bigger paycheck. Even at the worst place, it's a much bigger paycheck. And you're just like, I'm happy to have a job. Sign me up. Like, y'all do a bunch of surgery. I can do surgery. I'll be there. And when you get into the day to day, like, it's just a lot different than when you're a trainee. The stress is higher. Like day to day, like they're your patients, but you also have more free time in some ways. I did, and I think that you just don't understand the nuances of the finances of your clinical practice, of what you want very well at all. And I think that some people get very lucky and know, or not, the Jim just maybe smarter than I am about this. That could be very well how it went down. Matter of fact, that's probably the explanation.
Maybe I missed all the red flags.
That's what I'm saying. Like I personally had some skepticism about my job going in because of the research component. I really liked it. So I knew that this was a possibility, but I thought it was a great place to start. I had a lot of support. I had a lot of cool cases. I was doing very advanced neurotology. But at the end of the day, I knew after 6 months to a year that I cared more about building a practice and taking care of patients. And the only thing that I was going to miss was teaching. And I get to do some of that now. So it was, to me, there was some writing on the wall. And it was just more of me just being like, okay, you've done this now for 60 months to a year. You're fine. If I had to do it the rest of my career, I could have done it. It was just, I didn't love it. And what I'm doing now is a lot more work. I'm working a lot harder, but I like it a lot more.
So it's really important that you figure out what your priorities are. And even if you do know what your priorities are going into the job, they can change, or things may reveal themselves. And it's not all about the money. I took a pay cut to go from my first job to my second job, but it was worth it because of things that were important to me.
Yeah. It's easy too, that if you're someone who's published a lot of papers and been very academically productive, which unfortunately a lot of neurotology fellows and applicants are, that you're going to be pressured into going to academics. And I think that's the right choice for most people. And for me, I would have been, I would have been very happy at an academic job where I did, 100% clinical, for instance. But, I think that it's easy to get pressured into certain things by your mentors, and they mean very well almost all the time. It's just, sometimes you just got to step back and be like, is this for me or is this for somebody else? And I think that just make sure you do that when you're going through the process.
I have a question. I think we briefly mentioned this, but I've heard from other people before that, to make sure that you ask for certain equipment, microscopes, chair, instrumentation that you may need. Have you guys had any experience or thoughts about that, or struggles with that?
It really depends on what kind of practice you're going into, or whose role you're filling. And so if you're walking into a practice where you're taking the job of another neurotologist, you probably have all of the things you need. Although maybe some things may need some updating, but those are things that you can negotiate. And so part of your contract, is, the things that you need to do your job. And so, like you said, microscopes, a chair that's up to date, having enough ear instruments to get you through the day. And so it's important, in many jobs, you get to do a second look. You don't have to do that when you first go to interview. But if you're taking a second look at an institution, take a close look at those things and make a list and ask for those things.
So I have a lot of experience with this, because my first job, I had to do nothing, because it was the fellowship. I was at, I was used to, I knew the scrub techs and I knew the instruments. The second job, I basically replaced all the otology sets. had to talk about contract negotiations with cochlear implant companies. I had to get a new microscope, and there was enough of that here. It was just outdated, and basically what you've got to find your adult voice when it comes to stuff like this, because these hospitals will, they will get that stuff for you. I mean, it's very much in their financial interest, because, think about a microscope that costs $150,000. If you use it for 15 years, it's going to pay for itself easily. And so it's, if you're going to a place like Candace was saying, that already has a neurotologist there, or a couple, then you're probably going to be just fine. If you're not, then you have to be very picky about what it is. And thankfully, a lot of people can help you. Like at your fellowship job, they can pull cards, and you can get instrument names, and you can get microscope names, and patient monitor names, and all this stuff. And you don't really think about that much until you're actually trying to figure out what those names are. And so those things become very important very quickly if you don't have them. So.
One of the things that I did before I left was two things for equipment. I guess I printed every list. The scrub techs and the nurses, they go through a checklist. Everything, they check the sets. So I asked them to print that list for me, and it's like a 1,000-page document with micro print on there. But it's worth it, because if you've ever looked through these inventory books, there's like 14 different kinds of right angle picks. And when you're in fellowship, you just ask for the right angle pick. And so you need to know the details there. And so just ask for that list so you don't have to think about it. The second thing I did was I printed all of my fellowship directors' dictated operative notes, so that I had a template for dictating my own operative notes, because we didn't see a ton of cases all the time, particularly for some unusual skull-based stuff. And so to make sure you hit the highlights in terms of the operative dictations, those were the two things I printed out and took with me. So.
Yeah, I did the same thing. I took the pick list or whatever. I took the OR preference cards for my attending surgeons. I took, like Jim said, all of the instrument list for all of the ear trays at the two institutions. Because even though in my first job, I was going to places where there were neurotologists, each neurotologist has their own favorite set of instruments. And coming out of fellowship, you're probably going to want to use the instruments you were just using. And so take those lists with you. And then if you have, I don't know what the dot phrases or smart sets or whatever, save all of that stuff and take it with you so that you can upload it into your new EMR.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Right.
Feel free to share my contact information with anybody who wants to ask a question offline. I'm more than happy to talk to whoever.
Awesome.
Yeah, likewise, Mallory, please send that out. My email too.
Got it. Will do. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. This was super helpful. And we'll post it online so people also have access to it whenever they want or for reference later. I think we'll sign off now. Thanks again, everybody.
Good seeing you guys. Have a good one. Good luck, everybody.
Thanks, guys. All right. Thanks, Jameson. Thanks, Candace. Bye-bye, guys.